Good evening and welcome to the November edition of For the Love of Words. Tonight we have the poet Miriam O'Neill and the musician and songwriter Steve Rapson. We start our interviews with Miriam O'Neill. Welcome, Miriam.
Thanks for having me.
You have published your first collection of poems recently, and it's called We Start With What We Are Given. And I think the first thing I'd like to ask you is, what was the process in putting together the poems that went into the collection?
Oh, well, first you write them, and then you print them, and then you put them all over the floor and look at them and say what goes with what. And then you tear it all apart, the book, and you put them back on the floor, and you do it all over again. And eventually you begin to see which poems work together, which poems don't have any relationship to the other poems. You play that game, one of these things is not like the other. And then you give it to a good reader of poetry and ask for some feedback, which is what I did. So the poems were written primarily over the last 5 years. There were a few much older poems, but most of them were written within the last 5 years. And then my dear friend Zvinia Orlowski, who has 6 books of poetry to her name, took the manuscript from me and gave me feedback about the order, the arc, how things came together.
Now, you have published, before this book, you've published poems in a number of literary journals, the Marlborough Review, Ragtime, Southern Poetry Journal, Agni. Are any of the poems that you published in those journals, are they in this collection of poems?
Oh yes, absolutely, yeah. Probably 9 of the poems that are included in this manuscript were previously published, and there are acknowledgments in the front of the book.
Now, one of the other areas that you are actively involved in, I believe, in the art of poetry is translation. Is that correct?
That's true, yes.
And could you give the audience a little bit of a background of how you got involved in translating poems and what kind of poets you translate?
Okay. I only have translated Italian poetry. And the way I became involved in Italian poetry was on my first trip to Italy, at which time I spoke no Italian. But I discovered a writer whose work I wanted to know more about, and I couldn't find her in English. I knew about her life, and I knew about her reputation for her poetry. So I came home from Italy that trip with 3 of her books and the intention to study Italian.
Now, that poet is Alda Marini?
Yes.
Okay. And after you came home with that intention, how did you fulfill that intention?
Well, I started with a local adult education class at the Duxbury High School, which is not too far from where I live, and for beginning Italian, and then I went to more advanced Italian, and then I started studying more on my own. And then I joined ALTA, which is the American Literary Translators Association, and submitted my translation of a portion of Alda Marini's, one of her books of poetry, to a fellowship competition and won. So I was amazed. But I did win, and I did travel to Dallas to present my work.
And when was that?
That was in 2007, so it's been a while.
Okay. Are you still, at this time, involved in translating any of Marini's work, or?
I have been trying to find an editor for Marini's, a publisher for Marini's work, but it's a real catch-22 because American publishers want to know that you have permission to publish. And in this particular poet's case, the Italian publishers want to know that you have a contract. So we're at sort of a
Catch-22.
A catch-22.
Yeah.
But I am continuing to refine. I have now translated 3 of her books, and someday I'm hoping that I will publish here.
Now, how old is her work? How far back do we go with her
She
work?
started writing in the 50s, late 50s, and she died in 2008 or 9. So she had a prolific career.
Yes.
And she had an interesting life, and she was sort of an enfant terrible. How do you say it in French? Terrible.
Enfant terrible.
Enfant terrible. Si. I answer in Italian. She was sort of the child prodigy of Montale and people like that, very famous Italian poets. So her state funeral, her funeral was a state funeral in Milan with thousands of people lining the streets to see her coffin go by.
Besides talking about Marini's background, how did you first come to poetry?
Oh, as a very small child, it's the music of poetry that I love. And I'm Irish, of Irish descent, so there's music, there's that lyrical sensibility for language that I grew up with. And I started writing poems when I was in the 5th grade, maybe. And I can remember that my first poem was called Sea Breeze, because I lived near the ocean. So.
Okay, and do you still have a copy of that somewhere?
I do not, but a woman who I knew as a teenager stopped by last year to see a sister of mine and said that she could remember that poem. She could remember me reciting that poem, and I thought that was just phenomenal, that somebody remembered my very first poem.
Now, as you got older, what poets did you become interested in? What poets' work influenced you or attracted you? I assume W.B. Yeats must be in this somewhere.
Well, the thing is that as a girl in the 60s and early 70s, as a young woman, the school system that I went through a private Catholic school system, and I suppose all the public schools too, taught the poetry of dead white men. So I figured that if I wanted to be a poet, I was out of luck because I wasn't a man. I wasn't an old white man, and I wasn't dead. So the likelihood that I would ever have my poems out somewhere in the world was small. And then I found Emily Dickinson, but she too was dead. So it became a fixation of mine to find the living poets. When I was a kid and Robert Frost read for John Kennedy's inauguration, right. I thought, okay, he's old, but he's not dead.
Right, right.
And I moved on from there. It's when I ask people who they read, what poets they read, I'm always interested if they just tell me about that canon that is taught in the schools, then I encourage them to go outside of that canon, because there are so many wonderful, wonderful poets writing right now. And one of the things that I'm doing right now, as often as I can, several times a year, is I review a book of a contemporary poet and publish it, to keep that going, to keep people's voices out in the world as much as possible.
Who's the most recent poet that you've reviewed?
Well, let's see. I just submitted a book review for a book by Nancy Mitchell, poet Nancy Mitchell. It's her 4th book of poetry, and it's called The Out-of-Body Closet. And it's an amazing book about the experience of disassociation from self and how we recover our emotional selves once they've been wounded. And that's coming out in Ragazine in December, I believe. So.
And what would you say the theme of the poems you're going to read tonight is? Let me rephrase that. Is there a universal theme that runs through the poems you're going to read this evening?
Well, the title poem, We Start With What We're Given, sets the tone, I think, for the whole manuscript, because even though the poems are often different in their subject matter, they attend to the idea that we have to take what's in front of us and go from there, and that we sometimes resist using what we have or living with what we have, and making something new out of it.
Well, I'm certain that the audience that will listen to you read your poems tonight will not resist, and hopefully they will go out and they will buy a copy of your book. We start with what we were given. It's a pleasure to have you here this evening, and we look forward to hearing you read.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Delivered. The little creek, its mossy shoulders, fox scat, metallic green beetles in black thumb lengths of dung, cracked freshwater clamshells, flecks of moon, birds stirring in the brush. Sky fills the sylph of water the way a child fills its mother up until she becomes simply vessel, bears down like night on a mirror. Eyes collect each particle of light. The mind assembles, wraps itself in the odor of cold water, in laughter lugged from each little current, all of it cocooned in a pocket of a woods. Before the nurse swaddled me, I lay trembling. An icy creek a boot-clad girl had splashed through, her eyes fixed on the far side. Speaking of the dead, at the slumber party we asked the Ouija board, "Who's there? Get the letter F." Then, soon. We discuss what happens after dying. One girl insists that in the coffin, hair and nails still grow. We scare ourselves describing what we'll look like then. Except Maureen, who sits across the room, robe wrapped tight, chin rigid, and suddenly someone whispers about her mother. And one by one, we try to imagine how that feels. My mother breaks her arm sliding down the stairs on a mattress. "How did you break your arm, Mrs. English?" "Sliding down the stairs." "Did someone push you?" "All my daughters." "Was there an argument?" "Yes, about who'd go first." "Why did they push you, Mrs. English?" "I told them they could." "Why would you let them push you down the stairs?" "I got to fly. I got to scream like a girl at Godzilla." The blessing. The night my father kissed my brother Pat on the neck, it was summer, and the crescent moon had already set, and we were sitting up late on the patio, singing something from Carousel, maybe Mr. Snow, maybe If I Loved You. And a car rolled in the driveway, headlights dark, engine cut. And my father flew out of his chair and ran down the path, so we ran too. And there was Pat in his navy blues, cap flat on his head, home from Saginaw. And our father came up behind him, arms open to take him in, and he kissed the only part of our brother he could reach that way, the nape of his neck. He kissed him. And then it was over, and years would pass, and they would leave this earth without another touch between them. But I carry them the way they were that night. Father kissing son, son leaning in to take that blessing. We start with what we're given. We read the play in wilted rooms where Venetians clack as lifted sashes siphon spring into the gloom. The boys whose voices crack mumble music they cannot hear, while the girls recite their lines, half in defiance, half in fear. Sister Helen Joseph stops us at each archaic or unfamiliar word, so our pace becomes the pace of patience in an ethered world. 1 week later, under clouds the shape and shade of unwashed lambs, we ride in a parade of yellow buses to see the film version. So odd to fill the faded velvet seats at noon and sit in solid dark all afternoon. Balcony off limits, girl and boyfriends kept apart, we watch as Zeffirelli breaks our hearts. It is the nightingale, says Juliet, as she wakes to shadowed dawn. But we know it is the morning's lark, although if tested we could not describe its song, since we've never heard a bird herald the day. Still, we know Romeo must go away. It is the nightingale, cries Juliet, her voice pitched with despair. Her pale breasts rise like moons through the veil of her dark hair, and Romeo, who is turned from us as from his one night's wife, pauses to listen, and in doing so gives us his slender back, a length of thigh, the curve and cleft of buttocks bared, all in our rose as the projector's light plays over each one's gaze. We stare at what of one another we have only dreamed till then. We mark the loveliness of lovers in that dark. And this becomes our tale of Romeo and Juliet, this crush of flesh and grief, as they cling to one another on the bed, then part, not knowing when they'll meet again. And though we know, we hope that now, somehow, because he's forced their beauty on us like a draught that wakes us from our childish sleep, Zeffirelli will revise the end. Take back the lark. Bread. 1. There's an epigraph with this poem. Young girls who had friends among the male inmates and who used to get gifts of food asked me to draw their pictures. The payment, a piece of bread. On Saturdays, I gather the week's stale slices, dip them in milk and egg sprinkled with cinnamon and sugar, fry them in butter. I warm the maple syrup so it will saturate the gold brown crust. Pour small glasses of juice at the table. The house fills with the smell of bread and coffee. The scrape of forks on ironstone, our only shared sound. The sticky spot, he leaves the only guarantee that we were both at table once the plates are cleared. This is the price, I tell myself, the cost. I cannot quite believe. The memory of what I wished for, a soft amber drop. I sponge away before it hardens. The next poems I'm going to read have to do with Esther Laurie, who was an artist who survived the Holocaust and painted and drew her way through her time in the Kovno ghetto in Lithuania, and then in several in several concentration camps. And she haunted me for a while. And this poem is about that haunting. It's called Visitation. She crawls up onto my bed and tucks herself behind my bent knees. We cannot separate. A thin broth of moonlight caught in the trees spreads across the garden brush, so one side of every stick shimmers while the other sides melt into one another, a mass grave of cherry, pear, and pine. It's 3 a.m. when she shifts to sit on my book of windows between my water glass and blue lamp. She stares at me as if I were her mother dreaming, or a fever lingered in my bones. But she does not sing to me or stroke my ear the way my own mother did when I was small and facing down some shadow demon. She is only here because I spoke her name today. So she was conjured, her eyes faint as the night sky, her pinched fingers flick at the empty space, inscribe a scrap of linen only she can see. I turn my back and feel her shift again, curled against my hip. I know she is not sleeping. It's a way of being and not being she learned in the stifle of Stutthof. How to be unseen while seeing. how to lay your hope in a coffin and pretend it is a bed, how to ink the prisoner's numbers back into legibility, make the unseeable seen. I want to tell her it isn't a sin to sleep. The mind will not punish the body in dreams. The body will find its own way. The dim blister moon will fade in daylight. I would stroke her foot if I could reach it. I would pull it against my ribs, the way my mother warmed my own feet when I had skated too long on Rabbit Pond, rubbing the blood back into circulation. She'd say the itch and sting are good signs. Tonight, I am awake with Esther. My hands are open and warm, and she is considering what it would mean to close her eyes and rest, if I will promise to keep my own eyes open until morning. The Kovno ghetto was where Esther Laurie started her time of internment, and it's one of the two major cities in Lithuania. So this series of poems has dates to relate to the shift in her experience there. Kovno Ghetto, April 1942, Portrait before Shabbat. Smoke is difficult, its shapes amorphous and undurable. Ash is more predictable, able to hurl itself into a place and stay there. With the wind's help, it will shift its way down to melt and stain the pocked ice, or shrivel on the wet spring grass, or land on some edge fine as a blade against the neck, just below the jawline. She has watched the elders pull their beards taut in contemplation, as if the sun by rising had licked the morning clean, and the mud that shone between the rows of cabbages were the glow of Jerusalem. Her pentimento mingles shame with resistance. And who will walk into the holy city? This is a second poem about bread. Stutthof, 1944, Bread 2. Sawdust mixed in the dough fills bellies cheaply, so the factory lines stay full. When a prisoner drops where she is standing and is dragged aside, her mates think about her portion. They know it won't nourish the way bread should. Still, they want it. That way, maybe a few more days. They have heard the bombers in the distance. And one of her jobs in Liebisch, which was the last concentration camp she was sent to, was to be what was the Germans called Nummerschreiberin. I hope I'm saying it right. And these inmates did not have tattoos. They wore armbands with their numbers. And her job was to refresh the numbers as they started to fade. And she did this in the hospital, in the concentration camp. Breath blooms in the cold room. Her tongue smacks as she swallows. Tap of wooden nib on glass rim. Excess ink slips back into the bottle. She pauses, wrist suspended, then begins. The first number on rough linen is a wren scratching for wood mites. The second and third are spring leaves unfurling in the wind. The fourth one weeps, saturates the worn cloth and stains the table. With 8, a flash of anguish, how to face this infinity. The 7's quiet slash, the silent open mouth of Zed. Fingertips clouded with ink, she hands each armband to its prisoner. The doctor's wristwatch ticks. 2 glass syringes lie on a tray in the sick room beside 2 prisoners unfit for labor. She hears the bed springs squeak, and above the camp, the rush of hoopoes, the black barbs of their wings beyond number. And just one more. Morning prayer. Bless the gray weight of early morning, the plain of clouds over the soft lead of the kettle holes along the lower road. Bless each pond's horizontal totem, pitch pine or scrub oak, their dozen arms plunged in water, as if searching for a dropped key that will unlock summer. Bless the pond with a pussy willow fringe, whose 1,000 gold-green thumbs have bamboozled the moon into hanging until morning. Bless the sun, still tangled in the woods. May it find its way into the blue.
Our thanks to Miriam O'Neill for her reading of her poems. And for our second interview this evening, we have the musician, singer, songwriter, Steve Rapson. How are you, Steve?
I am well. Thank you, John, for having me.
You're more than welcome. It's great to have you here. I think the audience would be very interested to know that, unlike so many of our musician guests, you do not have your professional roots in music. Your professional roots start with corporate America.
That is correct.
And what were you doing in corporate America?
I worked for the Gillette Company for 22 years. I was the last Horatio Alger story at the Gillette Company. In that, if you know who Horatio Alger was, started at the bottom, didn't go out on top, but I went out considerably higher than I went in.
And what was it that led you to leave corporate America and devote your career to music?
Sure. The company, after 22 years, said, we want you to go away and take this pile of money with you. And I said, thank you very much.
Well, yes, but how did you get to music? I mean, you could have gone to
Sure.
many different fields with a pile of money.
I was a band leader from 1974 until 1988. I led a rock band. We did general business, weddings, parties, bar mitzvahs, fraternity parties. I was the MC, the booker. I have a skill. And at the time, playing guitar was not one of them. I was a very marginal guitar player. But I had a skill and I could recognize talent. And so I would hire Berkeley, not students, but Berkeley professors and New England Conservatory professors to be my side guys. And I was learning to sing, and one night Mrs. Rapson said to me when I asked her how she thought it was going, she said, "Look it, you're not a great singer. Why don't you hire a singer?" And I thought, this is the smartest thing I have ever heard, and I hired a female singer, and that was the beginning.
Was that what Mrs. Rapson had in mind? A female singer?
She was supportive of the mixed genders, you know. You got to appeal to the entire audience. And the band took off, and we had a great run. In fact, I dissolved the band in 1988 on New Year's Eve, our last gig. Just had enough of Proud Mary and My Sharona.
Was your band primarily, based on those two songs, was your band primarily a rock band?
No, it was a general business band. So you start off with the American Songbook, and you end up with disco and rock and roll at the end of the evening.
Okay, that's quite a journey. Let's talk about the fact that you have a number of CDs, I'd say almost a dozen or so.
I do have a dozen, correct.
And 8 or maybe 10 of them are instrumental only.
Correct, solo guitar. That's my website for many years until I actually purchased my name, steverapson.com. So although I still own sologuitar.com, I put everything on steverapson.com now. I became a songwriter late in life. In my late 40s, I wrote my first song. And I'm not really a singer, but I do the best I can. And, you know, songwriting is poetry with music. And I became fascinated with the process. I joined a songwriting group, and every month we would meet, a dozen of us, sit in a room, and if I did not have my song written for that month, I felt like I had not done my homework. And so that propelled me to write songs.
Well, you have two CDs that are, you sing the songs on the
I do,
CDs.
sing my own songs.
One's called A Little Bit of Crow, I think, and the other's The Illustrated Man.
Correct. These are the only CDs upon which I vocalize.
Now, just out of curiosity, is The Illustrated Man related in any way to the novel by Ray Bradbury?
Not at all. My son-in-law is tattooed. When he's fully clothed, the only tattoos you see are on his hands. He's got True Self, true, TRUESELF on his knuckles. And the rest of his body is covered with tattoos. He has very little skin left that's untattooed. And he's a musician as well. And one night at some venue, he was wearing what they call a wife-beater T-shirt. You know what that is, right?
Yes, Marlon Brando made them famous in Streetcar Named Desire. Yes.
It's a horrible name, but that's what he was wearing. And as I was watching him perform, these tattoos were, front and center. And it was the genesis of my song, The Illustrated Man. And it's pretty much thinking of him in his life at the time.
Well, your most prolific CD in the sense of sales is the Patriotic Guitar.
Correct.
Correct?
Correct.
And could you give the audience a little bit of an idea about when this particular CD was created
Yes.
and how it came to be
Sure.
so popular?
Like all young men, I had a mentor at the Gillette Company. And when he left Gillette, his name is Jack Falvey, and he's in his mid-80s now, but he's still my mentor. And every now and then, he would give me a suggestion about what I should be doing with my life. And yeah, it's great. And often I would take them, and one of them was, I ought to have a CD, and it should be Patriotic Guitar. This was 1999, and I was like, oh, please. But I did it. I arranged all these songs that people associate with the military and with the birth of our country. And it turned out to be the most popular CD I've recorded. And although people don't buy CDs anymore, now they download music, and it's still the most downloaded CD of mine.
Right.
So I'm happy I did it. Did it in 1999, well before 2001 and 9/11. But when 9/11 occurred, I was getting orders for cases of this CD, and it was a mixed emotion to ship them out in the face of this tragedy that happened to our country.
Well, if you've already mentioned your website, steverapson.com, and I would urge the audience to go to that website because it's very, very versified. You have pages in which one can listen to samplings of your instrumentals, as well as something from the two CDs that you sing on. You also have I Can't Be Serious page, in which you have 11 or 12 amusing songs that you've written.
That's actually my latest CD, but since very few CDs are sold these days, it's all downloads, I electronically published it. So all the songs are there. I think I made maybe 25 just to hand out to people like you. But I also have a CD called Seeking Soul, which is about spirituality and what we think about God. And again, published pretty much on my website.
Now, is that a CD that you sing on, or is that?
Yes.
It is?
Yes.
Okay. Besides being a singer-songwriter, you are also a writer. This is called The Art of the Solo Performer.
Correct.
A field guide to stage and podium.
Correct.
Which, having heard your background, one understands why you would write such a book, to help other entrepreneurs in their field.
Funnily enough, I wrote that book because another mentor of mine suggested I should write it. I was doing speech coaching after I left Gillette. And I had a client who worked with me, and he was improving, and one day he suggested, I ought to have a book on public speaking. And since I was a television producer at Gillette near the end of my career and did a lot of advertising, and also was a band leader, I had some experience with how you comport yourself in front of the public. But when I came back to music as a soloist, I was totally ineffective. My hands shook, and I just was not performing to my standards. And by coaching others, I learned to coach myself, and working through what is the problem with being alone in front of an audience. and how does one get better. And so they say, I say that self-help books are first written to the self. And I've sold many of them, way more than my CDs, which I find totally annoying, but we take what we can.
Well, we are about to see exactly how you have improved and how you now are going to be the living proof of the
Truly.
information that's in this book.
Yes, this is called pressure, John, in case you're wondering.
Well, we are so glad you're here tonight and that the audience will have a chance to hear your music and some of your actual songs.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me here at Easton Cable with my friends John and Kim at the board, and my new poet friend Miriam, and Mrs. Rapson in the background as always. We're going to start off with a song from my first CD on which I vocalized, which is called A Little Bit of Crow. I have the recipe for those who would want it. Write me at steverapson.com. Once I ate a little bit of crow, and a little wino. Once I ate a little bit of crow, it all went down with a little wino. Once I ate a little bit of crow. Once I ate some words I said all in my bread. Once I ate some words I said, they all went down with Johnny Walker Red. Yeah, all went down with Johnny Walker Red. A little bit of crow, a little wino, words in my bread, and a little bit of red. A little bit of crow, a little wino, words in my bread, and a little bit of red. Yeah, once I ate a little bit of crow. Once I drank from the river of fire, I sank real low, not getting any higher. Once I was drinking from the river of fire, and I was sinking real low, not getting any higher. Yeah, sinking real low, not getting any higher. It's a little bit of crow, a little wino, down to the river in the fire I go. A little bit of crow, a little wino, down to the river in the fire I go. Whoa, whoa. Each time I have one last glass, I must ask before I go. Whoa, whoa. May I please have a doggy bag to take home a little bit of crow? Yeah, once I ate a little bit of crow. Well, you want to get to heaven, I'll tell you what to do. Don't you cook up what's bad for you. Might have been a lot of things that you wish you didn't do, but learn how to cook and there's a heaven for you. Yeah, learn how to cook, you can get to heaven too. It's a little bit of crow, a little wino, down to the river and the fire I go. A little bit of crow, a little wino, down to the river and the fire I go. Yeah, once I ate a little bit of crow. I don't think I will have a fill of a little bit of crow. Yeah, baby. I'm now going to play my wife's favorite song of mine. This is from my electronically published, meaning on my website, CD called Seeking Soul. And this is called I Am Yours. If there's a storm outside your door, if there's a pain you can't endure, if there is nothing of which you're sure, then I am yours. If you are lost, if you are old, if you are tossed out in the cold, if your last hope has been sold, then I am yours. I am yours. I am yours. You are mine, as it's been through all time. I am yours, and you are mine. And should you doubt that I am there, if you cry out in your despair, what's it all about? That's your first prayer, and you are mine. Oh, I am yours, you are mine, as it's been through all time. I am yours, you are mine. I am yours. And I can't stay too serious for long, thus my latest electronic CD, I Can't Be Serious. This is called Alien Abduction. And if you have been abducted by aliens, I want you to know that I am not making fun of you. I'm just reporting as the song goes. It was a dark and stormy night. The wind was blowing hard. My dog would not stop barking. He was tearing up the yard. Bright lights in my window, creatures on my lawn. Well, I ran out the back door, grabbed my dog, and we was gone. Oh, we ran down the alley with a flying saucer close behind. A tractor beam grabbed hold of us for an encounter of some kind. Oh, although I have no proof of anything I say, I swear it is the truth. It happened on the day that the aliens came knocking. And my dog, well, he ain't talking. I was suspended in this spaceship, cold and wet and nude. The aliens poked and stiffed me in ways that were quite rude. My dog, they let sit on the couch. It looked just like a throne. They brushed his fur and petted him and gave him a big bone. Well, this odd scene before me, I began to comprehend. My dog may be my best friend, but he's an alien. Oh, there's aliens among us, living close to you. Professor John Edward Mack has said it must be true. It must be true. Professor John Edward Mack, I mean it, check him out. Now we are back at home. My dog is in the yard. I still feed him, go for walks, and take him in the car. But every now and then, he stares up at the sky. Then he looks over at me, and he winks one eye. Oh, oh, oh. Although I have no proof of anything I say, I swear it is the truth. It happened on the day that the aliens came knocking. And my dog, well, he still ain't talking. Whoa, whoa, whoa. No, my dog still ain't talking. Alien abduction. One of the most popular song forms is the blues. And funnily enough, I've written over 100 songs and only one that could be categorized as a blues. And this is it. This is called the Narrow Line Blues. This is where the old guy remembers the first line of his lyric. I walk a straight and a narrow line. I walk a straight and a narrow line. There's a hole in my pocket where I lost my last dime. In every new town, I don't stay too long. In every new town, well, I don't stay too long. You can't hang around when your money is gone. Down and out, well, it ain't no sin to be down and out. It ain't no sin. I ain't going to hell. I think I already been. Just when you think nothing to lose, just when you think you got nothing to lose, that's when you find another hole in your shoes. The Narrow Line Blues. So the older I get, the more I write songs that have to do with that very condition of getting older. And this one I wrote, the most recent song I have written. It's called Never Been to Mexico. I never been to Mexico, never rode a rodeo, or crossed the desert south to Timbuktu. Never found that pot of gold, never thought that I'd get old. There is much that I will never do. And now I am an old man, sitting in my chair, thinking about where I might have been. Yeah, I'm too soon old and too late smart. I'm looking for the light before the dark. Never sailed the Amazon, never ran a marathon, never found someone whose love was true. Never thought, never did what I was told. I was Waterloo. Yeah, and now I am an old man, and I'm sitting in my chair, thinking about where I might have been. Yeah, I'm too soon old and too late smart. I'm looking for the light before the dark. And though my youth it was misspent, and all my sins I now repent, I hope it's not too late to make my mark. For as long as I am here, I might as well get off my chair and find the light before it gets too dark. Oh, oh, I'll find the light before it gets too dark. Well, we want to thank you all for listening. And if you want to hear even more of this, steverapson.com is where you will find me. And we're going to go out with a little instrumental just so the credits can have something fun to run over.